They say a woman alone on the frontier is a tragedy. But at Love and Scar Stories, we know solitude can forge unbreakable strength. This is the story of a scarred heart, a practical marriage, and the quiet courage that turns survival into belonging. Out on the harsh western prairie, it all started with one knock on a schoolhouse door. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Clara Whitmore never imagined her quiet life as the schoolteacher of Redfern Ridge would ever be disturbed. At 33, she had come to accept solitude as her companion. The hope of marriage and children folded away, like an old letter she no longer allowed herself to read. Years of silence had taught her how to endure. Then one afternoon, Jed Calder stood in her doorway, broad as a barn door, weather-scarred, hat held low in his hands, and spoke words that cracked the careful order of her world. "I need a wife," he said in a deep, steady voice. "And you need strong sons to see you through the winters." There was no courting, no honeyed language, just plain truth, offered by a man who did not know how to dress it up. Winter was coming. Tongues in town were sharpening. And when the choice finally came, Clara surprised even herself. She agreed to marry him, not out of love, but out of necessity and dignity. Yet, as autumn faded into the hard promise of winter across the open plains, something quiet and unexpected began to take root between them. What started as survival hinted at something warmer, something she had long believed was beyond her reach. The September wind carried the smell of dying grass through Redfern Ridge, slipping between the warped boards of the one-room schoolhouse where Clara had spent nearly 8 years teaching reading and sums to the children of ranchers and shopkeepers. The old building groaned under the prairie gusts, its scars earned through countless Wyoming seasons. Clara stood by the chalkboard, brown hair pulled into its familiar tight bun, watching Billy Wade wrestle with his multiplication tables. At 33, her days followed a pattern she knew by heart. Rising before dawn, walking the quarter-mile from her small cottage to the schoolhouse, guiding a roomful of children aged 6 to 14, then returning home to the silence that waited faithfully for her. 7 times 8, Billy, she said softly, her voice carrying the patience that had earned her quiet affection throughout Redfern Ridge. The boy frowned in concentration, tongue caught between his teeth. 56, Miss Whitmore. Well done. She smiled, and the warmth of it softened features that were never called striking, yet always made people feel seen. Her mother had once told her that her eyes were her finest trait, soft hazel, expressive, though now touched with a sadness that had deepened with time. Afternoon light poured through the windows, stretching long shadows across the desks where children bent over their slates. Clara had arranged those desks herself years ago, placing them to catch every bit of usable light. The schoolhouse bore her mark everywhere. The alphabet cards painted by hand, the modest shelf of books bought with her own savings, the pot-bellied stove she tended with near-maternal care. This place was more than her work. It was her refuge, her proof of worth. Here she mattered, not just as an unmarried woman, but as Miss Whitmore, the teacher who taught a struggling boy to read, who showed girls they could master numbers as well as boys, who kept order and learning alive in a frontier town where schooling was often treated as an afterthought. While the children worked, her gaze drifted toward the window and the endless prairie beyond. Rolling grassland stretched in every direction, broken only by cottonwoods tracing hidden watercourses, stark and unforgiving, yet beautiful all the same. A land that demanded everything from those who stayed. She had not truly chosen it. 8 years earlier, at 25, she had come west with a teaching certificate and the quiet hope that distance might heal the hurt of a broken engagement back in Ohio. Henry Cole had been respectable, safe, the son of a banker, and when he proposed, she believed her life was beginning. But respectability had proven brittle. When his father objected, no dowry, no influence, Henry yielded. The end came quietly, in her father's parlor, his eyes fixed anywhere but her face as he spoke of prudence and reconsideration. 2 weeks later, Clara boarded a train west. Her parents pleaded, but she was determined to build a life beyond the judgments that had wounded her. The early years were harsh. Isolation, brutal winters, nights when the wind howled like something alive. Slowly, she found her footing. The children loved her. Their parents trusted her. She built a life that was small, but solid. And yet, as former students married and raised families, as she attended christenings and birthdays always as the kindly onlooker, a familiar ache returned. She told herself she had made peace with being alone. But peace was not joy. Bootsteps on the schoolhouse porch pulled her back to the present. She glanced at the clock, nearly 3:30. Soon she would dismiss the class and walk home alone. Miss Whitmore, Anna Reed, one of her brightest pupils, raised her hand. "I've finished my arithmetic. May I help Billy?" "Yes, dear. That would be kind." Clara watched the 12-year-old move beside the younger boy, explaining patiently in the plain way children often understand best. Anna would make a fine teacher one day, she thought. If her parents allowed her to continue her schooling beyond Red Fern Ridge. As the lesson continued, Clara felt the weight of the prairie beyond the window, and of a life she had built carefully, believing it was all she would ever have. The sound of boots on the wooden steps grew heavier, closer, until Clara Whitmore caught the unmistakable chime of spurs. A rancher then. She smoothed the front of her gray wool skirt and lifted her chin, ready to greet whichever parent had come, perhaps with questions about lessons, perhaps asking for extra tutoring before winter closed in. The door opened with its familiar creak, and a shadow stretched across the floor. This was no ordinary shadow. It filled the doorway, broad and solid, blotting out the afternoon light. Clara looked up from her desk, and her breath caught. Jed Calder stood inside her schoolhouse, his black Stetson held low in both hands large enough to span the width of her desk. She had seen him before, of course. Red Fern Ridge was too small for strangers. But she had never stood this close to the man who owned more land than anyone in 3 counties. He was immense, well over 6 feet, his shoulders shaped by years of hard labor and weather. Dark hair, touched early with silver at the temples, framed a face carved by sun and wind. Yet it was his eyes that held her. Deep brown, steady, unexpectedly gentle beneath the weight of his size. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice slow and low, just as she remembered from church and town meetings, like distant thunder rolling across open land. "Might I have a word with you?" The room went quiet at once. The children sensed it, the presence of power of a man spoken about in lowered voices. Billy Wade's eyes widened, caught somewhere between awe and unease. Jed Calder was a name wrapped in legend. A man said to calm wild horses with a murmur, said to have once driven off wolves armed with nothing but steel and will. "Of course, Mr. Calder," Clara answered, though her voice rose despite her effort to steady it. "Children, please continue your work quietly. I'll be just outside." She stood, suddenly aware of how small she was beside him. At 5'4", she was no slight woman, but next to Jed Calder, she felt almost fragile. She followed him onto the narrow porch and closed the door behind her. Sunlight warmed her face, yet a chill slid down her spine. This was unheard of. Jed Calder seeking her out, alone, for a private conversation. In all the years she had lived in Redfern Ridge, they had exchanged little more than polite nods after Sunday services. Now he stood with the prairie stretching behind him, his presence calm but weighted with intent. This was no casual visit. "Miss Whitmore," he began, then stopped, as if choosing his words with care. When he spoke again, his tone was deliberate. "I know this must seem strange, me coming here like this, but there's something important I need to say." Clara folded her hands in front of her, a habit born of nerves she rarely allowed herself to show. "I'm listening, Mr. Calder." He met her gaze fully then, those dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart falter. From inside the schoolhouse came the muffled sounds of children's voices, the rhythm of learning that had shaped her life. "I need a wife," he said plainly, as if commenting on the weather. "And you need strong sons to guard your winters." The words struck her like a blow. She stared at him, certain she had misunderstood, but his expression did not waver. Serious, waiting. At home, tucked away in a small wooden box beneath her mother's trinkets, lay a simple gold wedding band. She had not touched it in months, yet now she saw it clearly, the symbol of a life she had convinced herself was no longer meant for her. Her voice failed her. She tried again. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking, Mr. Calder." "I'm not asking," he replied gently, firmly. "I'm stating facts. I've got a ranch that needs a woman's hand, and winter's coming hard." He paused only briefly. "And you've got no one when the snow comes deep. And this town isn't growing kinder to women who stand alone." His bluntness should have offended her. Instead, she listened. There were no fine words, no promises made for effect. Only truth laid bare. "Mr. Calder," she said at last, her voice barely more than breath, "I hardly know you." "You know I'm honest," he answered. "You know I work and I pay what I owe. You know I've never been married, never had children, and you know this ranch could give you more security than a schoolhouse ever will." He hesitated, then added quietly, "And you know you're tired of being alone." That last truth landed with painful precision, leaving her with no defense at all. How had Clara Whitmore seen straight through what she had worked so hard to conceal, even from herself? Heat crept into her cheeks, and she turned slightly away, her gaze drifting across the open prairie, rolling endlessly toward the horizon. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the sigh of wind through dry grass and the distant lowing of cattle. From inside the schoolhouse came Anna Reed's calm voice, patiently explaining fractions to the younger children. This was Clara's world, carefully built, deliberate, independent. And this man was asking her to step away from it for something she could barely imagine. "I don't understand why you came to me," she said at last. "There must be younger women, unmarried women who would." "I don't want a girl," Jed Calder cut in, not harshly. "I want a woman who knows herself, one who's faced hard things and stayed standing. Someone I can talk to when the day's work is done. Someone who can hold her ground out here." He nodded toward the schoolhouse. "You've been doing that for 8 years. That tells me what I need to know." Something stirred in her chest. Not hope exactly, but close enough to make her breath hitch. When had anyone last spoken to her as if she mattered for more than usefulness? As if she were more than the town's dependable spinster teacher, offered polite pity instead of real regard. "What is it you're proposing, Mr. Calder?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "Marriage," he said simply. "A partnership. I won't dress it up and call it love." He met her eyes. "I don't know much about that. But I know respect. I know how to take care of what's mine. You'd have a good home, security, standing as my wife." He paused, choosing his words with care. "And in time, maybe, we'd find more than convenience in each other's company." The honesty of it stole her breath. No pretty speeches, no promises of passion. Just two adults acknowledging the truth of frontier life. And yet, beneath his plain words, there was something more. Something in the way he looked at her that hinted at depth beyond practicality. "I'd need time to think," she said. "Of course." He set his hat back on his head, the motion making him seem even larger. "But don't wait too long, Miss Whitmore. Winter's coming, ready or not. And some choices grow heavier the longer you carry them." He tipped his hat in farewell, then stepped down from the porch and crossed toward his horse, a massive bay that seemed the only creature in Redfern Ridge built to bear his weight. Clara watched him mount with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, then ride off until he became a dark speck swallowed by the prairie. She stood there for a long moment, one hand resting on the railing, her thoughts tangled by the impossibility of what had just passed. Inside, the children continued their lessons, unaware that their teacher's orderly world had been shaken to its core. When Clara finally returned, Anna Reed looked up at her with curious eyes. "Was that about one of us, Miss Whitmore? Are we in trouble?" "No, dear," Clara said, her voice calm despite the storm inside her. "Nothing like that." Yet as she moved among the desks, guiding and correcting, her mother's wedding ring burned in her thoughts. A symbol of dreams she had buried long ago, now unearthed by Jed Calder's unexpected visit. That evening, Clara sat alone at her small kitchen table, staring at the marriage contract Jed had left with her. It was simple and direct, a reflection of the man himself. The paper lay between two lives, one familiar and safe, the other uncertain and wide open. The handwriting surprised her. Careful, deliberate, educated. The terms were more than fair. She could continue teaching if she wished. She would have her own allowance, separate quarters at first, and full respect as his wife in public matters. "Marriage of practical convenience," she read aloud, "between Jed Calder and Clara Whitmore, entered into for mutual protection and benefit, with the understanding that affection may grow, but is not required." The language should have repelled her. Instead, it steadied her. No illusions, no false promises. Just sense and honesty. A knock sounded at the door. She folded the contract quickly, uncertain why she felt the need to hide it. Through the window, she recognized Martha Pike from the Mercantile, her round face tight with curiosity. "Clara, dear," Martha said when she stepped inside. "I hope I'm not intruding so late, but I heard the most remarkable thing at the store today." "Please, come in," Clara replied, already knowing the news had traveled fast. "Would you like some tea?" "That would be lovely." Martha settled into the small parlor, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Now tell me, did Jed Calder really come calling at the school today?" Clara busied herself with the kettle. "He did. And Martha leaned forward eagerly. What did he want? Clara poured the tea with steady hands. He came with a proposition. What kind of proposition? Martha Pike leaned forward, her eyes bright with curiosity. There was no use pretending secrecy. By morning, everyone would know. Small towns had a talent for that. Better she speak plainly and shape the truth herself. He asked me to marry him, Clara Whitmore said, keeping her voice even. Martha's teacup rattled against its saucer. Marry him? Jed Calder? He's never shown interest in any woman, not in all the years he's been here. And you hardly know each other. That's exactly what I told him, Clara replied, settling back with her own cup. He said it would be practical. He needs a wife, and I need... She stopped, the word catching in her throat. Security. Martha stared at her. And what did you say? I told him I'd think about it. Martha set her cup aside, concern replacing curiosity. Clara, dear, I know winters are hard on you out here alone, but marriage to a man you don't love? She hesitated. Are you sure that's wise? The question lingered. By ordinary measures, no, it wasn't. But ordinary measures hadn't brought Clara much happiness. What would you have me do? Clara asked quietly. I'm 33. I have no family, no prospects, and each year makes a conventional match less likely. Jed Calder is offering a different sort of life, but he's so... Martha gestured, searching. Imposing, intimidating. All those stories about his strength, his temper. Aren't you afraid? Clara considered it. She knew the stories, the power in his hands, the way men stepped aside for him. But she remembered something else. He was gentle with me, she said at last. Respectful, honest about what he could give and what he expected. There are worse things than marrying a fair man. Martha shook her head, unconvinced. The whole town will talk. Some will call it practical. Others will call me desperate. Clara finished. Maybe I am. But sometimes desperation is what pushes you to change. After Martha left, Clara returned to the contract. She read it again, then a third time, turning each clause over in her mind. If she agreed, the wedding would be within 2 weeks. She would move to his ranch, but could keep the schoolhouse as long as she wished. He would provide for her and protect her as his wife. In return, she would manage the household and, in time, perhaps bear his children. By morning, visitors came, one after another. By noon, half the town had found reasons to stop by the schoolhouse or her cottage. Reactions were mixed. Shock, envy, disapproval. I think it's romantic, declared Mary Patterson, once her student and now a mother of 3. Like a storybook, the mysterious rancher and the schoolteacher. I think it's scandalous, countered Ruth Harlan, the preacher's wife. Marriage should be built on love and Christian devotion, not convenience. Henry Cole offered a steadier view. Jed Calder is a good man, if solitary, honest, hard-working, prosperous. You could do worse, Clara. But it was Billy Wade, 8 years old, who struck deepest. Walking him home, he looked up with solemn eyes. Miss Whitmore, are you really going to marry Mr. Calder? I'm thinking about it. Why? He asked. Because he fixed our fence when Papa hurt his back and didn't ask for anything. And he let me pet his horse. His hands are big, but he was gentle. Mama says gentle hands mean a gentle heart. That evening, Clara stood at her window as the sun sank into fire and gold across the prairie. The land's beauty and harshness braided together, inseparable. She thought of the life she'd built, orderly, useful, respectable, and its limits. At 33, the dreams she'd carried from girlhood, a husband, children, a home filled with laughter, had withered like flowers without rain. But what if it didn't have to end that way? What if, instead of romance, there could be partnership, respect, shared purpose? Jed Calder was offering her the chance to find out. She took the contract from the drawer and read it once more. Then, steady-handed, she signed her name. Clara Whitmore, soon to be Clara Calder. The act felt both immense and simple, like stepping through a door she had never seen, yet somehow always known. Tomorrow, she would give Jed her answer. Tonight, she set away her mother's wedding ring and prepared to discover what kind of life could be built on honesty instead of illusion, on partnership instead of passion. The contract lay on the table, signed and sealed. A narrow bridge between the life Clara Whitmore had shaped with care and the future she could not yet see. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the promise of change. The next morning, she took the signed papers to Jed Calder's ranch. She carried her teaching slate with her, the smooth, worn stone that had been her companion for 8 long years. It felt right to bring it along, a quiet emblem of the independence she was not ready to surrender. The Calder ranch house rested in a shallow hollow between 2 low hills, shielded from the worst of the winds while open to the early sun. It was larger than she expected. A solid log home with a wide porch and several well-kept outbuildings that spoke of success earned the hard way. As she drew closer, she saw Jed near the corral, his powerful frame unmistakable even from a distance. He looked up, set aside the bridle he'd been repairing, and walked toward her with that long, effortless stride that seemed to eat up ground. He stood bareheaded in the morning light, dark hair threaded with silver. Something in his expression, hope edged with uncertainty, told her this decision mattered more to him than his plain words had ever admitted. "Miss Whitmore," he said, touching the brim of his hat when he reached her. "I didn't expect you so early." "I wanted to speak with you before school," she replied, drawing the folded contract from her reticule. "I've made my decision." His gaze dropped to the paper, and she saw his jaw tighten. Whether from anticipation or nerves, she couldn't say. When he looked back at her, his face was carefully composed. She said nothing, only placed the signed contract in his hands. He read it slowly, pausing at her signature. Something shifted then, his shoulders easing, as if a weight he'd carried for days had finally lifted. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. "As sure as anyone can be about the unknown," she said. "I do have conditions, Mr. Calder." "Jed," he corrected gently. "And I expected that. Go on." She had rehearsed this walk and this conversation a dozen times, but standing before the man who would soon be her husband, the words felt clumsy. "I want to keep teaching. At least for now. The children depend on me. And I need to know I'm still useful in that way." "Agreed," he said at once. "What else?" "Separate bedrooms at first. I know that may sound sensible," he interrupted. "We're strangers entering a practical arrangement. There's no need to rush things." His easy acceptance startled her. She had braced for resistance, for claims of a husband's rights. Instead, he treated her wishes with the same steady reason he'd shown from the beginning. "Anything more?" he asked. She glanced down at the slate in her hands, its surface smoothed by years of lessons. "I want your word that you'll respect who I am now, that you won't try to turn me into what you think a wife ought to be." Jed studied her in silence, his gaze so intent it made her feel laid bare. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Clara," he said, and hearing her given name in his deep voice sent a shiver through her. "I asked you to marry me because of who you are, not in spite of it. I don't want a different woman. I want you." The words struck her with unexpected force. When had anyone last wanted her simply for herself, not for what she represented or provided? The feeling was overwhelming, terrifying and wonderful all at once. 2 weeks, he continued, returning to his practical tone. "Will that be enough time to speak with the school board?" "Yes," she managed, her voice rough. "Yes, I think so." "I'll talk with Elias Boone about the ceremony," he said. "Nothing elaborate, just what's required. A few witnesses." She nodded, then hesitated. There was still so much unsaid. "Jed," she said, testing his name and finding it fit better than she expected. "What do you expect from me? Day to day, I mean. I've lived alone for 8 years. I don't really know how to be a wife." A faint smile touched his mouth. "I don't know how to be a husband either. I reckon we'll learn together." The simplicity of it was both comforting and daunting. No sweeping romance, no grand promises, just 2 people agreeing to figure life out side by side. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange suspension between old and new. The town watched her with fascination and concern, as if she were a curiosity that had stepped outside accepted boundaries. Some women offered advice on cooking and housekeeping, assuming she knew nothing of running a home. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, took it upon herself to explain marital duties in vague, embarrassing euphemisms, lessons that might have been amusing if they hadn't made Clara's cheeks burn. Other women came with their own stories, some joyful, some cautionary. Each tale offered with a knowing air of those welcoming a newcomer into a quiet, complicated sisterhood. The men were simpler. They either congratulated Clara Whitmore on making a sensible match, or regarded her with a blend of pity and confusion. The look men saved for women who chose paths they themselves could not imagine. Through it all, Clara continued teaching. She kept her lessons steady, her care for the children unchanged. The slate remained her anchor, its familiar weight in her hands, reminding her that no matter what awaited her, she was still Miss Whitmore. Teacher, guide, keeper of young minds. It was Anna Reed who finally asked the question Clara had been avoiding. "Miss Whitmore, after you're married, will you still be our teacher?" "For as long as you need me," Clara replied, making a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Then little Lucy May looked up with the fearless honesty of childhood. "Will you have babies?" Heat rushed to Clara's face. Children, part of Jed Calder's original proposition. Strong sons to guard her winters. The idea of bearing his children, of creating life with a man she barely knew, thrilled and frightened her in equal measure. "Maybe," she said carefully. "Someday." As the wedding day drew near, anticipation wrestled with panic. There was no wedding gown. Such finery felt wrong for a marriage built on practicality. But she owned a blue wool dress that softened her features and brought out her eyes. It would have to suffice. The night before the ceremony, Clara sat alone in her cottage, perhaps for the last time as a single woman. Her slate rested against the lamp, catching the glow. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Clara Calder, mistress of one of the largest ranches in 3 counties. The transformation felt unreal. She thought of the dreams she once carried. Romantic courtships, sweeping passion. a man who would love her above all else. Those dreams belonged to a younger woman now, someone who hadn't yet learned that life rarely followed the stories in books. Yet perhaps there were other dreams, steadier ones, built on partnership and respect. Perhaps those could grow into something deeper than fleeting passion. The slate reflected her face back at her in wavering lines. Tomorrow she would learn what kind of woman she would be as Jed Calder's wife. Tonight, she was still Clara Whitmore. Independent, alone, but no longer resigned to remaining so. The prairie beyond her window stretched endless and demanding, full of possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning in Elias Boone's small church, with only a handful of witnesses present. Clara wore her blue wool dress and carried a modest bouquet of prairie flowers, purple asters and golden black-eyed Susans, that Jed had gathered himself from the hills near his ranch. Standing before the altar, she was keenly aware of the difference in their size. Her hand felt small in his as they exchanged vows that were plain rather than poetic. Promises of care in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, with no mention of love. It was exactly what they had agreed to. Yet something in her chest ached for the words left unsaid. When Reverend Boone pronounced them husband and wife, Jed lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckle. The tenderness of the gesture brought unexpected tears to her eyes. And just like that, it was done. She was Mrs. Calder, bound to a man she had known less than a month. The wagon ride to the ranch was quiet, filled with the careful silence of two people who had committed their lives to each other without knowing what that commitment would demand. Clara held the bouquet tightly in her lap, trying to steady the flutter in her stomach. "Nervous?" Jed asked as the house came into view. "Yes," she admitted. "You?" "Yes," he said, and his honesty eased her more than reassurance ever could. The ranch house looked different now. Not a place she was visiting, but her home. The windows gleamed, the porch had been swept, and fresh curtains hung in the front windows, details that hadn't been there before. He helped her down from the wagon with care, his hands lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "I've set aside a room for you," he said, lifting her small trunk. "Upstairs, facing east. You'll get the morning light." Inside, the house surprised her. It was warm and well-kept, with a large stone fireplace and comfortable chairs. And then she noticed the bookshelf, solid and full, lined with volumes she hadn't expected. Shakespeare, Dickens, Emerson. "You look surprised," Jed said, following her gaze. "I am," she admitted. "I didn't expect that I could read." There was amusement in his voice, not offense. "My mother was a teacher before she married my father, Samuel Calder. She insisted on learning, even for a boy meant for ranch work." The revelation shifted something in Clara's understanding of him. She had assumed practicality meant a lack of education, despite the careful script of his handwriting. "I brought some books of my own," she said hesitantly. "I hope that's all right." He smiled. "I was hoping you would." "More than all right," Jed Calder said, gesturing toward the bookshelf. "I was hoping you might add to it." He walked Clara Whitmore through the house. The wide kitchen with its modern stove, the dining room large enough to seat 8, and the parlor where an upright piano stood against the wall. He admitted, with a trace of embarrassment, that he couldn't play it. It had belonged to his mother. Everything was clean and well cared for, yet unmistakably the home of a solitary man. It lacked the small human touches, flowers, color, the sense of being lived in together. Her room was upstairs, airy and welcoming, with windows that overlooked the rolling hills she had come to love during her years in Redfern Ridge. A small writing desk stood near the window, her few belongings arranged neatly on the dresser. "I thought you might want space for schoolwork," he said, indicating the desk. "There's a lamp with good light for reading." The care behind those choices surprised her. This was not the effort of a man simply fulfilling an obligation. It was the work of someone who had thought about her comfort. As if sensing her reaction, he said quietly, "I want you to be happy here, Clara. This arrangement benefits me. I don't want you feeling you drew the short end of it." That evening, they shared their first meal as husband and wife. Beef stew and fresh bread he had made himself. Another surprise. Conversation came slowly at first, careful and tentative. "Tell me about your students," he said. "Which ones keep you busy?" She found herself easing as she spoke, about Billy Wade's trouble with arithmetic, Anna Reed's quick mind, the challenge of teaching children of so many ages in one room. Jed listened closely, asked thoughtful questions, and made comments that showed an understanding she hadn't expected. "You're good with them," he said when she finished describing a difficult day. "It shows. Folks talk about you with respect. It's not easily earned here." The words warmed her more than she'd anticipated. In return, she asked about the ranch. He spoke of cattle, weather, sickness, the balance between grazing and preserving land, and the quiet satisfaction of building something meant to last. After supper, he went out to finish evening chores while she explored the house. The kitchen was orderly, stocked with care, arranged for usefulness rather than pleasure. The parlor bore signs of solitary evenings: a half-finished chess puzzle, books marked mid-chapter, a chair angled toward the fire. When he returned, he found her studying the bookshelf. "Find anything good?" he asked. "You have excellent taste," she said, pulling out a volume of Tennyson. "This is one of my favorites." "Mine too," he replied, stepping beside her. "Especially Ulysses, the idea of always pressing toward the unknown." She looked up at him, surprised. "That's exactly what I love about it. The thought that it's never too late to change, to become something more." They stood there in a quiet understanding, something subtle shifting between them. Recognition, perhaps, or the first real sense of companionship. "I'll let you settle in," he said at last. "Tomorrow will be busy. I've got work on the north fence, and you'll want to prepare for class." She hesitated. "You don't mind having a wife who keeps working?" "I'd be proud," he answered without pause. "Not many men can say their wives serve the community the way you do." Later, as Clara prepared for bed in her new room, she reflected on how sharply her life had turned. That morning she had been Miss Whitmore, schoolteacher, alone by choice and necessity. Tonight she was Mrs. Calder, married to a man who read poetry, gathered wildflowers, and considered the angle of lamplight at a writing desk. It wasn't love, not the kind she once imagined. But it was more than convenience. It carried the hint of something she hadn't dared to hope for. Outside, the prairie stretched beneath a sky thick with stars. For the first time in 8 years, Clara fell asleep in a house where she was not alone. 3 weeks into their marriage, she knelt in the cold earth behind the ranch house, hands deep in soil as she planted seeds Jed had surprised her with. Beans, lettuce, herbs, they were more than provisions. They were a promise of staying, of roots, You don't have to do that, Jed said, approaching from the barn where he'd been tending an injured mare. I could hire someone. I want to, Clara replied, brushing dirt from her hands. I've never had space for more than a few herbs. This feels hopeful. The word lingered between them. Hope meant more than practicality. It meant looking forward. Their days settled into rhythm. Clara rose early to make breakfast, walked to the schoolhouse, returned in the afternoon to find Jed working the land. It was an ordinary life taking shape. Quiet, demanding, and slowly, unexpectedly shared. Evenings settled into a quiet pattern. Clara Whitmore graded papers or read by lamplight, while Jed Calder handled ranch accounts or fixed what needed fixing. Conversation came easier now. Weather, cattle, her students, his fences, and sometimes there were brief, electric moments, their fingers brushing when she handed him his coffee, or the look she caught him giving her. Thoughtful, searching, as if something more complicated was taking shape between them. I spoke with Silas Crow yesterday, Jed said one afternoon, dropping to his heels beside her and studying the neat rows she'd laid out in the garden. He's been asking questions about our marriage. Clara's hands paused in the soil. Silas Crow owned the neighboring spread, a man known for sharp ambition and a long-standing resentment of Jed's success. She'd seen him at church, a handsome man in his 40s, with eyes that measured everything and a smile that never quite reached them. What kind of questions? She asked. Whether it's a real marriage, Jed said evenly, or just a legal arrangement to keep your good name intact. His voice stayed calm, but tension ran beneath it. He seems to think a woman like you wouldn't choose a man like me unless desperation had something to do with it. The words stung, not because they were entirely false, but because they stripped their careful partnership of dignity. Clara felt an unexpected flare of protectiveness, not just for herself, but for Jed and the honest way he had entered into this marriage. What did you tell him? She asked. That our marriage is none of his concern, Jed replied. His eyes stayed on the dirt between his boots. But it got me thinking about appearances, about what folks expect from a husband and wife. She understood at once. They lived together like courteous strangers. In church they sat side by side but rarely touched. In town they were polite, never affectionate. To an outsider, it might look exactly as Silas suspected, a marriage built on a paper alone. Are you worried about what people think? She asked. I'm worried about what it could mean for you, he said, finally meeting her gaze. If folks decide this isn't a proper marriage, it could spill over into the school. Some families might not want their children taught by a woman they see as questionable. The thought tightened her chest. Her reputation was everything. Years of trust could unravel quickly if doubt took hold. What do you suggest? She asked. For a moment, the big man looked almost shy. We could make more of an effort in public, he said. Small things married people do. Taking your arm when we walk, sitting closer in church. He hesitated, color rising faintly in his cheeks. Maybe you could call me something other than Mr. Calder when folks are around. The request was modest, reasonable, and the vulnerability in his expression stopped her from smiling. This was the same man who faced storms and wild stock without blinking, now carefully asking permission to look like her husband. I think that would be wise, she said gently. For both of us. Relief crossed his face. Good. They worked in the garden another hour, talking of safer things, what grew best in prairie soil, how to shield tender shoots from late frost. Yet Clara felt the boundary between them easing, widening by inches. That Sunday, she slipped her hand through Jed's arm as they climbed the church steps, feeling his solid strength beneath her palm. During the service, she sat close enough that their shoulders brushed. When Elias Boone asked the congregation to greet their neighbors, Jed placed a light hand at the small of her back, so gentle she might have missed it, yet firm enough to be seen. The change in reaction was immediate. Mrs. Patterson smiled with approval. Even Silas Crow, seated 2 pews ahead with his wife, glanced back, his eyes narrowing as he took in their closeness. Afterward, outside the church, Henry Cole remarked on how well Clara looked. "Marriage suits her," he said. Jed's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her arm. "Thank you," he replied, quiet pride in his voice. "I'm a fortunate man." The words were proper enough for public ears, but when he looked down at her, Clara saw more than performance. There was warmth there, maybe even affection. The discovery sent a flutter through her chest. Hope, attraction, possibility. Walking home, their new ease felt both natural and strange. She noticed how he shortened his stride for hers, how he guided her around puddles and ruts with a protective hand. "Thank you," she said as the ranch house came into view. "For what?" Clara Whitmore asked quietly. "For caring about my reputation, about my work." She slowed, then stopped. "I know this isn't the kind of marriage you might have chosen if things had been different." Jed Calder stopped with her and turned to face her, his expression grave. "Clara," he said, and hearing her name in his deep voice still sent that familiar stir through her. "You need to understand something. I didn't ask you to marry me because I had no other choice." He held her gaze. "I asked you because I wanted you. The woman who's taught this town's children for 8 years. The woman who reads Tennyson, plants gardens, and speaks her mind when something matters." The force of his words left her momentarily without breath. This was not the careful, distant arrangement she had agreed to. This was personal, terrifying and wonderful all at once. "I wanted you too," she admitted softly, surprised by her own honesty. "Not just the security, not the respectability. You, the man who reads poetry, builds bookshelves, and treats a marriage contract like something sacred." They stood there on the path to the house, seeing each other with new clarity. Their sensible arrangement was changing into something neither had planned, but both were beginning to want. That evening, as they sat in the parlor after supper, Clara found herself watching Jed as he read. Lamplight caught the silver threading his dark hair. There was a calm to him that reminded her of the quiet satisfaction she felt working beside him in the garden. Behind the house, the rows of seeds waited beneath the soil for spring rain and sun. Like their marriage, she thought. Something planted for necessity, now slowly, carefully growing into something that could sustain them. The threat from Silas Crow arrived on a gray November morning. He came to the ranch with 2 hired men and a surveyor, claiming the north pasture belonged to him under newly discovered records. Clara watched from the kitchen window, her hands gripping the sink until her knuckles whitened. Jed stood in the yard, still, controlled, dangerous, while Crow gestured toward the disputed land. Even at a distance, she saw the tension in her husband's shoulders, the restraint of a man holding anger in check. When the men finally left, Jed came inside and sat heavily at the table, turning an old silver pocket watch in his hands. She had never seen it before. "My father carried this for 30 years, he said quietly, thumb tracing the worn engravings. He was working the north pasture when he died. They found him there, with this watch still ticking in his vest. Clara crossed to sit opposite him, drawn by the pain in his voice. He rarely spoke of his family, guarding his past with the same reserve he gave everything else. "How did he die?" she asked gently. "Heart attack, they said," Jed replied. "But he was 42. Strong as an ox." His jaw tightened. "I always wondered if there was more to it." He stared at the watch. He'd been arguing with Crow over water rights and grazing lines. My father trusted people, believed men settled things with words. The implications settled heavily between them. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind rattling the windows. "You think Silas Crow had something to do with your father's death?" "I think he's the kind of man who takes what he wants," Jed said flatly, "no matter who gets hurt." He snapped the watch shut. "He's circled this ranch like a vulture ever since my father died. Today he claims the north pasture, says he's got a deed 5 years older than ours." Bitterness edged his voice. "Convenient timing, now that I've got a wife to think about." The protectiveness in his tone warmed her, even as fear settled deep in her stomach. She understood now. Their marriage had made them both targets. "What do we do?" she asked. "Fight it on paper first. Get our own surveyor. Examine the records." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw uncertainty, perhaps even fear, in his steady brown eyes. "But Clara, you need to know what marrying me may cost. This could turn dangerous." "Are you trying to scare me away?" she asked, surprised by the firmness of her voice. "I'm trying to give you a chance to leave before it gets worse." The words cut deeper than she expected. After weeks of growing closeness, he still imagined she might want an escape. "And go where?" she shot back. "Back to my cottage? Back to being the pitied spinster who couldn't even make a practical marriage work?" "You could leave Redfern Ridge altogether," he said quietly. "Start over somewhere else. I'd see that you had enough money to—" "Stop." The word cut through him so sharply that Jed Calder leaned back in his chair, startled. "Just stop. Do you honestly think I'm the kind of woman who runs at the first sign of trouble? Do you think 8 years of teaching frontier children, surviving prairie winters alone, carving out a life in a hard country like this, has left me so fragile that I can't face a land dispute?" He studied her, his expression steady but weighted. "I think you're brave. I think you're strong. And I think you deserve a peaceful life," he said quietly. "You've already given so much of yourself to other people. I don't want you paying for my problems with your safety." The anger drained out of her as quickly as it had flared. This wasn't doubt, it was care, protection, fear of losing something he had only just found. "Jed," Clara Whitmore said softly, reaching across the table and laying her hands over his. The contact startled them both. It was the first time she had reached for him. "I'm not leaving. This is my home now. Our home. Whatever comes, we face it together." He turned his hands upward, enclosing hers in his larger grip. The calluses told a story of years of labor, and she traced them gently with her thumbs, struck by how careful those powerful hands could be. "I've never had anyone to protect before," he admitted. "Never had someone whose safety mattered more than my own. It scares me." Her breath caught. This man, who could face storms and broken horses without flinching, was afraid for her. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "We protect each other." That night, for the first time since the wedding, they sat together on the parlor sofa instead of opposite chairs. It was a small shift, but a meaningful one. As she worked through lesson plans and he reviewed property papers, their shoulders brushed now and then, warmth passing between them that had nothing to do with the fire. "Read to me," he said suddenly, nodding toward the book of poetry she had set aside. She opened the worn volume of Tennyson and read one of her favorite passages. Her voice filled the quiet room, and she felt his full attention settle on her, steady and unbroken. When she finished, he didn't speak right away. "Your voice is beautiful," he said at last. "I could listen to you all evening." Heat rose to her cheeks. "My students would disagree. They say I get overly dramatic." "They're wrong," he replied, his voice rough with something she couldn't name. "You make the words breathe." Later, as they prepared to part for the night, Jed caught her hand as she passed the foot of the stairs. "Clara," he said, her name carrying weight now. "Thank you for staying, for choosing this instead of running somewhere safer." She met his gaze, seeing the worry, the strength, the quiet hope. "Thank you for giving me something worth standing for." He lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles, as he had on their wedding day. But this time the gesture lingered, warmer, charged with what was growing between them. Upstairs, Clara lay awake with the memory of his touch, certain now that what had begun as practicality was becoming something far more rare. Outside, November wind tore across the prairie, promising harsh days ahead. Inside their home, something fragile and living had taken root. The proof came from the most unlikely place. Tucked between the pages of a cattle-breeding book she'd borrowed from the church library. The folded paper slipped free and drifted to the floor. At first glance, it looked like any other land deed, the sort that cluttered a territory forever redrawing its borders. But her trained eye caught what others would miss. The paper was aged, yes, but the ink was too dark, too fresh. The handwriting tried to imitate an older style, but subtle strokes betrayed a modern hand. And the seal, her pulse quickened. Grant Holloway, a surveyor licensed barely 3 years. Heart pounding, Clara gathered her skirts and ran across the prairie toward the north pasture. Wind tore loose strands from her hair, her breath burning in her chest. But she didn't slow until she reached him. "Jed," she called, thrusting the document toward him. "You need to see this." He took it at once. As his eyes moved down the page, his expression hardened, line by line, truth settling in like iron. "Where did you find this?" Jed Calder asked quietly. There was something sharp beneath the calm of his voice. Danger held in check. That made Clara Whitmore step closer without thinking. "Between the pages of a book from the church library," she said. Hidden like someone planned to come back for it, and didn't. She watched his face as realization set in. "It's a forgery, isn't it?" she asked. "The deed Silas Crow showed the surveyor." "More than that." Jed kept his voice level, but anger darkened his eyes like a storm rolling in. "This is a practice sheet. Look here." He pointed to faint marks in the margins, alterations, corrections. Whoever wrote this was testing versions of the handwriting before committing it to the final document. The truth hit her like icy water. He's been planning this for years. The land claim, the pressure, everything. "Longer than that," Jed said. He folded the paper carefully, his movements controlled. My father died 20 years ago this month. Right here in this pasture, alone. No witnesses. He stared across the disputed land, seeing another time layered over the present. I was 17, grieving, trying to run a ranch I wasn't ready for. If someone wanted to alter records, steal land, hide a crime, that would have been the moment. The weight of it made Clara's stomach twist. This wasn't just about property. It was about murder buried beneath forged ink and patience measured in decades. We have to tell someone, she said. The sheriff. Territorial officials. With what? Jed let out a short, bitter laugh. A page that proves someone practiced forging a deed. That's not murder, Clara. It barely proves fraud. Before she could answer, hoofbeats sounded behind them. 4 riders approached, dust rising around them. Silas Crow rode at the front, his posture relaxed, his men armed and watchful. Clara felt Jed's arm come around her, protective and solid. Calder, Crow called, pulling his horse to a stop. I'm here to give you one last chance to be sensible. Sign over the north pasture, and we avoid trouble. The answer hasn't changed, Jed said evenly. That land is mine. Crow's gaze slid to Clara, cold, assessing. Even if it puts your pretty little wife at risk? The threat was clear. Jed's arm tightened, but fear never came. What rose in Clara, instead, was fury. You're wasting your breath, Mr. Crow, she said, her voice carrying the same authority she used to command unruly classrooms. We know about the forged deed. We know you've been planning this fraud for years. Color drained from Crow's face. His hand twitched toward his gun. You don't know what you're saying, don't I? Clara took the paper from Jed and held it up. Grant Holloway's seal on a deed that's supposed to be 23 years old, when he's only been licensed for 3. Handwriting that looks suspiciously like yours. Practice marks in the margins where you refine the forgery. Crow's composure shattered. Give me that paper. So you can destroy it? Clara slipped the document into her bodice. No. This goes to the territorial authorities, along with a full account of your attempts to defraud my husband. Your husband, Crow snarled, civility gone. You think he told you everything about that tidy little marriage? Ask him about the night his father died. Ask him what really happened in this pasture. Jed went rigid beside her, but Clara held Crow's gaze. What are you talking about? He didn't die of a heart attack, Crow said, venom in his voice. He died because he refused a fair business offer. When I suggested a private solution, he threatened to involve the law. Crow smiled, cold as winter. So I taught him that some decisions can't be undone. The words landed like a blow. Clara heard a sound tear from Jed, half growl, half grief. You killed him, Jed said, his voice barely human. I defended myself, Crow replied smoothly. Unfortunately, his heart couldn't handle the strain. By the time help arrived, it was too late. It was a lie shaped just carefully enough to pass as self-defense. Clara understood instantly. And then you spent 20 years forging documents to steal his land, she said. Waiting until his son had a wife, something precious you could threaten. Crow shrugged. Nothing personal. Silas Crow spoke again, his voice smooth and almost reasonable. A sharp contrast to the rifles his men now held without pretense. Just business, he said. Land has value. I saw a chance to buy it at a fair price. Murder and fraud, Clara Whitmore replied coldly. That's your idea of fair. Crow lifted one shoulder. The frontier is a hard place. Accidents happen. Men vanish. His eyes lingered on Clara. And sometimes widows decide it's easier to leave painful memories behind and start fresh somewhere else. The threat slid through her like ice. Yet beneath the fear, something fiercer took hold. An unyielding resolve to defend the life she and Jed Calder were building. To stand against the man who had already destroyed so much. "You made one mistake, Silas," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "What's that?" "You assumed I could be frightened into silence." She met his gaze without blinking, letting him see the strength that had carried her through 8 lonely years of frontier teaching. "You were wrong." For a heartbeat, doubt flickered across Crow's face. Then his expression hardened. He motioned to his men. "You've got until sundown tomorrow to sign over the north pasture," he said. "If you don't, your husband might have an accident, just like his father. And pretty young widows." His smile turned ugly. They often need comfort. He spun his horse and rode off, his men following, leaving Clara and Jed alone in the disputed pasture. The forged paper burned against her chest where she'd hidden it. Proof of crimes that stretched back 20 years now threatened their future. "He killed my father," Jed said quietly. The words ripped from somewhere deep. "Yes," Clara answered, taking his hand. "And now we're going to make sure he answers for it." That night, Jed went into the barn and returned with a gun case Clara had never seen. Inside lay a well-worn Winchester rifle, cradled in faded velvet. He lifted it with care, checking each part with practiced ease. "I swore I'd never touch this again," he said softly. "Carried it 3 years in the Army. When I came home, I promised myself I was done with killing." Clara watched him clean and load the rifle, his movements precise and controlled. This was another truth about the man she'd married. Not only the rancher who read poetry and built bookshelves, but a soldier shaped by violence. "You don't have to face this alone," she said. He looked up, pain and tenderness crossing his face. "Clara, if something happens to me, nothing is happening to you." She opened the case and took out a smaller pistol, one that fit her hand. "And I won't hide while you fight for our future. You don't know how to use that. Then teach me." Her voice held the same resolve that had sustained her through prairie winters and broken hopes. For a long moment, they faced each other across the table, the weapons between them marking a path neither had wanted. Jed finally nodded. "All right, Nom." In the barn, he taught her the basics. Never aim unless you intend to fire. Always assume a weapon is loaded. Finger off the trigger until the moment comes. They practiced with hay bales until her arms ached and her ears rang. By the end, she could strike the center more often than not. "You've got a steady hand," Jed said, pride threading his worry. "It's different shooting hay than people," she replied. "I know. But fear won't make you useless." The next morning brought allies. Henry Cole, Elias Boone, and several men from town arrived, armed and solemn. Clara watched from the window as they spoke with Jed. When he came back inside, some of the weight had lifted from his face. "Word spread," he said. "Crows made enemies for years. Henry remembers injuries among his hands, men who asked the wrong questions. Elias says families left town after disputes with him. They're willing to help? They're standing with us." Jed reached for her hand, his grip steady and sure. this was no longer only about their ranch. It was about stopping a man who had ruled this county through fear for decades. The plan they shaped was straightforward, born of necessity rather than bravado. Silas Crow had given his ultimatum, sundown. They were certain he would come himself, bringing hired guns to force compliance. The men from town would take hidden positions around the ranch, forming a deadly web that would leave Crow no clear path of retreat once violence broke out. "What's my part in this?" Clara Whitmore asked. "You stay inside," Jed Calder said. "Safe. We handle the rest." Even as he spoke, his expression betrayed the knowledge that she would refuse. "No." Her voice was calm, firm. She looked around the table, meeting each man's eyes with the same authority she used in her classroom. This began because Silas Crow believes a woman is a weakness he can exploit. "I won't hide while you risk your lives for me." Henry Cole cleared his throat. "Mrs. Calder, with respect, this isn't work for a lady." "With respect, Doctor," she replied evenly. "I've survived 8 years on this frontier alone. I can shoot. I can think under pressure. And this is my home. I have every right to defend it." Uneasy glances passed between the men, but Jed was watching her with something close to pride. "She's right," he said quietly. "This fight belongs to her too." Elias Boone shifted. "It goes against nature, a woman in a gunfight." "What goes against nature?" Clara shot back. "Is murder disguised as business. Silas Crow killed my husband's father and profited from it for 20 years. I will not cower while he threatens to do the same again." The argument continued, but in the end, they agreed. Clara would take position in the upstairs window, watching the road, ready to give cover if needed. It wasn't the yard, but it was a place of consequence, and it acknowledged her resolve. As the sun slid lower, the men moved into place. Henry behind the barn, Elias and 2 others among the cottonwoods by the creek, 1 man in the hayloft. Jed remained in the open, visible, seemingly alone. Clara settled at the bedroom window, pistol loaded, breath slow and steady. From there, she could see the road unspooling toward a town. Empty now, but not for long. Waiting was the hardest part. As shadows lengthened and the cold crept in, her thoughts drifted to how much her life had changed. 6 months earlier, she had accepted a small, quiet future as a solitary schoolteacher. Now she was married to a man she was falling in love with and bracing for gunfire. Silas Crow's threats had done what nothing else could. They had forced her and Jed to trust each other, to step beyond their careful arrangement into something real. Movement on the road snapped her attention sharp. 5 riders, armed. Crow unmistakable at the front. Her heart pounded, but her hand stayed steady. What came next would decide not just survival, but whether the life she and Jed were building would endure. Crow rode in with the confidence of a man used to winning. His guns spread out with practiced ease. He expected surrender. A frightened rancher, a pliant wife. He was wrong. "Be careful," Clara whispered. Whether to Jed, herself, or the fragile love between them. She didn't know. Beside her lay the school bell she had borrowed from the classroom, brass catching the last of the sunlight. 3 quick rings would signal Crow's arrival. 2 more when the shooting began. She did not wait long. Silas Crow entered the yard like a conqueror. His men fanned out, relaxed, ready. He raised his voice. "Time's up," he called. "You ready to be reasonable, or do we make this unpleasant?" Jed stood before the house, shoulders loose, the Winchester resting within reach. From the window, Clara could see the tension coiled in him, the readiness in his stance. "I told you yesterday," Jed replied evenly. "This land stays with me." Crow's smile thinned, carrying 20 years of practiced cruelty. Time to let go of the past and face what was coming. Clara's fingers tightened around the school bell. The riders were close now. Well inside the distance Jed had measured that morning. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but her hands were steady. She lifted the bell and rang it 3 times. The clear bronze notes rang out across the yard and open prairie, sharp and unmistakable. Silas Crow's head jerked up, his gaze snapping toward the house, scanning for the source. "What was that?" he demanded. "That," Henry Cole said calmly as he stepped out from behind the barn, rifle leveled at the nearest hired gun, "is the sound of your luck running out, Silas." Everything changed in an instant. Crow's men went for their weapons, but froze when rifle barrels appeared from 3 directions at once. Elias Boone emerged from the cottonwoods, his face stripped of its usual gentleness, resolve carved deep into his features. The other townsmen stepped into view, all armed, all ready. "You're outnumbered," Jed Calder said evenly, as he reached for his Winchester and brought it up, sighting straight on Crow. "Might be time to rethink your position." For a heartbeat, the yard held its breath. Armed men locked in place, tension humming like a live wire. Then one of Crow's men made the choice that ended any chance of peace. Lean, scarred, and twitchy, he lunged for his gun. Clara rang the bell twice more, the signal for battle. Gunfire shattered the stillness. The sharp cracks echoed off the hills as men dove for cover. Clara raised her pistol, sighted on a gunman moving to flank Henry, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil jolted her arm, harder than she expected, but the shot landed true. The man spun and dropped, clutching his shoulder as his weapon skidded across the dirt. For a split second, the reality of what she had done slammed into her. How fast a life could change, how violence left no room for hesitation or regret. Then the moment was gone. Below, Jed moved like someone born for this. Fast, controlled, lethal. Using the porch rail for cover, he worked the rifle with grim precision. One of Crow's men fell and did not rise. Another crawled away, wounded and panicked. Silas Crow dismounted, fury twisting his face, and advanced toward the house. "Come out, Calder," he shouted. "Face me like a man instead of hiding behind that schoolteacher wife." The words struck Clara like a slap. Heat flared in her chest. She leaned out the window, pistol steady, aimed straight at him. "I'm not hiding," she called down. "I'm right here." Crow looked up, their eyes locked. Surprise flashed across his face, followed by something darker, calculating. "You should have stayed in your classroom," he snarled, raising his gun toward her window. He never got the shot off. Jed exploded from the porch with a roar that seemed to shake the yard itself. "Don't you ever point a gun at my wife?" They collided in the dust, Crow's shot going wild as Jed tackled him. They rolled hard, fists and elbows and curses tangled together. Clara's breath caught. She couldn't fire without risking Jed. Around them, the rest of the fight was ending. The townsmen had driven off or disarmed the remaining gunmen. But the real battle, the one that mattered, was far from over. Crow was smaller, wiry, fueled by desperation. He tore free, scrambling back, his gun coming up again. "You should have died with your father," he screamed, finger tightening on the trigger. The school bell was still in Clara's left hand. Without thinking, she hurled it. The brass bell struck Crow hard against the side of the head with a dull, ringing crack. He staggered sideways just as the gun fired. The bullet tore through empty air where Jed had stood a heartbeat earlier. Then Jed was on him again. No guns, no distance. Just two men in the dirt. Crow, dazed and weakened, couldn't match Jed's strength or the fury driving him now. Within seconds, Jed had him pinned, hands locked around his throat, 20 years of grief and rage pouring into that grip. "This is for my father," Jed growled. "For every year you let me believe he died of nothing. For every night I wondered if I could have saved him." Crow's face darkened, his struggles weakening. The yard fell silent, the other men watching with grim understanding. This was reckoning, not chaos. But Clara saw it. The darkness in Jed's eyes, the edge he was about to cross. The soldier in him, the part that had learned too well how to end lives, was taking over. Fear sliced through her. "Jed," she called, her voice sharp, cutting through the haze of his fury. The sound of her voice, steady, pleading, unmistakably hers, rang louder than the bell ever had. "Don't," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "He isn't worth damning yourself for." For a heartbeat, Jed's grip tightened, and Clara feared he might not hear her at all. Then his eyes lifted, locking onto hers across the yard. In them she saw the man she had married, struggling against the weight of his past, love wrestling with vengeance in the depths of his gaze. Slowly, his hands relaxed. Silas Crow collapsed into the dirt, gasping and coughing, clawing for air, but alive. "You're right," Jed said at last, his voice hoarse, stripped raw by emotion. "He's not worth it." He looked down at the broken man beneath him. "But he will answer for what he's done." Henry Cole stepped forward, pulling a length of rope from his medical satchel. Together, the men bound Crow while he was still too stunned to resist. Between the forged deed Clara had uncovered and Crow's own confession spoken before witnesses, there would be no escaping justice. Murder and fraud would see him answer with his life. As the adrenaline drained away, Clara realized she was shaking. She set the pistol carefully on the windowsill and hurried down the stairs, her legs unsteady, her only need to touch Jed, to be sure he was real, unhurt, still hers. He met her at the bottom step, pulling her into his arms with fierce relief. They held each other tightly, trembling, words unnecessary in the wake of how close they had come to losing everything. "I thought he was going to kill you," she whispered against his chest. "And I thought he was going to shoot you out that window," Jed answered, his voice rough. "When I saw him aim at you." "But he didn't," she said softly. "We're here. We're both alive." Henry cleared his throat, giving them a moment before speaking. "We should get Crow to town. Best turn him over to the sheriff before rumors start flying and someone decides to take matters into their own hands." As the men prepared the wagon, Elias Boone approached Clara, holding something that glinted in the fading light. "I found this on the ground," he said gently. "Must have slipped from your things during the fight." It was her mother's wedding ring, the simple gold band she had carried for years, but never worn. Clara stared at it, then looked up at Jed. This man had given her not the sweeping romance she once dreamed of, but something far stronger. Respect, partnership, and a love forged slowly from shared trials and chosen loyalty. "Would you put it on my finger?" she asked quietly. Jed's hands were steady as he slid the ring into place, his eyes never leaving hers. "With this ring," he said softly, echoing words they had never truly spoken before. We're bound not by convenience or need, but by love. By love, she repeated, and the words felt like a vow deeper than any spoken in a church. The sun dipped low, setting the prairie ablaze in golden fire as Silas Crow was loaded into Henry's wagon, his hired guns either captured or dead. A reign of fear that had lasted decades ended as the wagon rolled toward town and judgment. "It's over," Jed said, his arm firm around Clara's waist. She glanced down at the ring now resting where it belonged. "No," she said quietly, "it's just beginning." The school bell lay dented in the dust where it had fallen, its bronze scarred but unbroken. Tomorrow she would return it to the schoolhouse, where it would call children to learning and neighbors to gathering. Tonight, it stood as something more, a symbol of the life she had built on her own and would now continue building with a man she loved. A life that began in practicality and survived fire. The prairie wind whispered through the grass around their home, carrying promises of seasons yet to come, of children who would run these fields, of a love tested and proven strong enough to last. 6 months after Silas Crow's trial and execution, Clara stood in the doorway of the nursery Jed had added to the house, her hands resting over the gentle curve of her belly. A cradle of prairie oak stood in the corner, built by Jed's hands, smooth, solid, enduring. Spring had come early to Redfern Ridge. Through the window, she could see the garden they had planted together thriving, beans climbing, herbs fragrant, and the young apple trees heavy with blossoms. "Talking to him already?" Jed asked softly from behind her, his arms wrapping around her, his hands settling protectively over hers. "I'm telling him about his father," she replied, leaning back into his warmth. "About the man who builds cradles and plants gardens and reads poetry by firelight." "Me?" Jed's voice held quiet amusement. "A mother knows these things," she said, smiling. "Besides, you wanted strong sons to guard our winters. Remember?" His expression softened, wonder and gratitude filling his eyes as he held her closer. Both of them standing on the threshold of a future neither had dared to imagine, but had earned together. "I remember so much from that day," Jed said quietly. "How afraid I was you'd turn me down. How sure I was asking too much of you." "You weren't asking too much," Clara Whitmore replied, lifting her hand to trace the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, marks left by laughter, by hardship, by burdens shared instead of carried alone. "You were offering me everything I thought I'd lost forever." From the open window drifted the sound of children's voices from the schoolhouse. In less than an hour, the bell would ring. The same brass bell that had once been a weapon, now restored to its rightful purpose, a calling young minds to learning. Clara had kept teaching throughout her pregnancy, with Jed Calder's steady support and the town's quiet approval, and she would continue until their child needed her more than her students did. "Martha Pike stopped by yesterday while you were in town," she said. "She wanted to know if we'd chosen a name yet." "And what did you tell her?" Jed asked, smiling. "That we're considering a few possibilities." Clara glanced up at him, eyes bright. "Though I do have a favorite." He chuckled. "Let me guess. Something literary? Byron, Tennyson, Shakespeare?" She laughed, the sound filling the sunlit nursery. "Samuel, after your father. So our son will grow up knowing the good man he's named for, and the legacy he carries." The emotion that crossed Jed's face nearly took her breath away. His father's pocket watch rested now on the mantel, not as a token of grief, but as a symbol of continuity, of love carried forward. Samuel Calder, Jed murmured, testing the name. It sounds right. A strong name. For a boy who'll know he's wanted, loved, and part of something bigger than himself. They stood together in easy silence, imagining what lay ahead. Spring plantings and harvest feasts, first steps and first words, the quiet work of building a life on a land that was harsh but honest, demanding but beautiful. Do you ever regret it? Jed asked suddenly. Giving up your independence, binding yourself to a rancher you barely knew. Clara considered the question carefully, as she had many times before. The woman who had signed that practical contract felt distant now. Someone resigned to solitude, convinced that love was a luxury she could never afford. I regret wasting years believing I wasn't worthy of this, she said at last. I regret all the time we might have had if I'd been brave enough to hope for more than survival. And I regret thinking a practical arrangement would protect me from getting hurt, Jed replied, his hands resting gently where their child stirred beneath her dress. Turns out love was the most practical choice of all. Just took me 35 years to see it. The school bell rang out across the prairie, clear and familiar, pulled by Anna Reed, who had volunteered to help as Clara's pregnancy advanced. Soon the schoolhouse would fill with eager voices and restless energy. Children learning lessons that would shape their own futures on the frontier. But for now, Clara and Jed stood in the nursery, surrounded by a life built from nothing but mutual need and cautious hope. The cradle waited patiently, a promise made solid, of dreams kept, of a love that began in practicality and grew into something rare and enduring. Beyond the window, the prairie stretched to the horizon. Once it had mocked Clara's loneliness with its vast, empty beauty. Now it spoke of abundance, of space to grow, to dream, to build something lasting with the man who had seen her worth when she could not. I love you, she said, the words still new and wondrous on her tongue. I love you too, Jed answered. And in his voice she heard all their tomorrows. Steady and passionate, grounded in reality yet lifted by hope. As constant as the prairie wind, as enduring as the grass that bent but never broke. Their baby kicked softly beneath her hands, as if in answer, and Clara smiled. Their son would grow up knowing he was wanted, born into a love story that began with a simple contract and became something rich, complicated, and beautiful. In the distance, the school bell rang on, patiently calling the future to begin. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting, as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deep fakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.